You are listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, I had the opportunity to interview Lya Badgley. Lya is an international fiction author who has written the book The Foreigner's Confession. Lya's next book, The Worth of a Ruby, is soon to be released. I'm here with Lya Badgley. Did I pronounce your name correctly?
Well, you got the Badgley right. My first name is pronounced Lya.
Lya Badgley, the author of The Foreigner's Confession and The Worth of a Ruby. Lya, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I'm happy to be here.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Sure. I am a writer of now 2 different books, the second of which will be coming out later this month, but we're here to talk about The Foreigner's Confession. I write suspenseful international fiction, and I like to use global conflict zones as they offer kind of a interesting background to my stories. I draw deeply from my personal experience living in Europe and Southeast Asia. I've done a lot of different things. I was in the music industry. I opened a restaurant in Myanmar. I interviewed insurgents on behalf of Human Rights Watch. And I microfilmed documents for the Tuol Sleng Museum of Genocide in Cambodia. And that I drew heavily on that experience for the book, The Foreigner's Confession.
Do you consider international fiction to be a genre? And if so, how do you define it?
Well, that's a good question. I didn't invent that term. I've seen it used elsewhere, but all of my books are set in international settings. Obviously, it's not so international for the people who live in those countries, but I'm making a big assumption that the majority of my readers would be coming from the United States. But I would hopefully define international fiction as something that is global in scope with its themes.
Without spoiling too much of your book, The Foreigner's Confession, what is that book about?
Well, The Foreigner's Confession it's set in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And basically, our protagonist, Emily McLean, has a horrific accident that shatters her world and leaves her an amputee. And then she moves to Phnom Penh, Cambodia to work with landmine survivors. It's a dual timeline historical fiction novel that's set in wartime Cambodia in the 1970s and the 1990s. And the 2 protagonists never meet, but they become deeply intertwined in a way that transcends time. And then an unexpected discovery at the Tuol Sleng Museum of Genocide leads our protagonist on this journey. It's a little bit, has slightly sort of magic realism elements to it, but I wouldn't call it magic realism.
Now, you have an upcoming book called The Worth of a Ruby, and without spoiling too much of your upcoming book, when will that book be released, and what is it about?
Well, I'm so excited to talk. Well, I'm excited to talk about all of my books, but this one is coming out. Unfortunately, I don't have a firm release date yet, but anticipating the end of this month, last week of October, first week of November. And basically, The Worth of a Ruby, here's the little blurb, is a priceless Burmese ruby leads Mallory Jones on a journey from the remote hills of Burma to the swelter of Bangkok in search of redemption.
Are both of your books self-published? Are both of them traditionally published? Or is one self-published and the other traditionally published?
Well, as you know, it's an interesting time to be a writer because we have lots of options. So the first album was, the first, I used to be in the music business. The first book was self-published with the help of a wonderful company called Girl Friday Publications, who helped me with the things that I had no idea how to do. This second book, The Worth of a Ruby, is hybrid press published with a company called Atmosphere Press. And I'm sort of navigating that new, every time you use a different method, there are different procedures. So I'm still working out. So please don't ask me which I prefer, but ask me maybe in 3 months from now.
I wrote my first book 4 years ago, and the writing world is still a learning process for me.
It's like, for me, it's like learning a different language, and skill set that is, I don't know, at my age, as a mature writer, shall we say, it's sometimes it's a lot. The writing is easy. It's just the marketing that's the tough part, right?
Yes, that is a very tough part, and that's the one part of the writing process that I still don't have a ton of knowledge about, to be honest.
What was your book about, Aaron?
It was a motorsports fiction novella featuring a lesbian protagonist.
Holy cow! So wow. So now that's a very specific genre.
My next question is, like me, you live with a disability, is that correct?
That's correct.
What is your disability, and in what ways does your disability affect how you live your life?
Well, I have multiple sclerosis. I was diagnosed a long, long time ago in 1987. So obviously have been living with it much of my life, it seems, much of my adult life. How does that, I don't know that it affects my ability to be a writer. So I'm quite lucky in that I am a writer. I think that, people with MS, everyone, there's no sort of one framework of disability that fits everybody. Everyone has all different kinds of challenges. For me, it's related to mobility. So being a writer is a really good thing that to do for a person who can't walk very well.
Now, I have a developmental disability, an autism spectrum disorder, and that affects me in many ways. I tend to be very physically clumsy. I fidget a lot. I have trouble socializing in person. It affects me in a lot of different ways. Autism and autism spectrum disorders don't affect everyone who has them the same way.
I have the little bit that I know. I can see that. It's interesting that, Aaron, that you chose to host a podcast for a person who you say that you're uncomfortable in social situations. I mean, this is kind of a social situation right now, right?
Yes, it is. Now, what is it like to live in Southeast Asia, and what is it like to run a restaurant in Yangon, Myanmar? I apologize if I mispronounced the name of that city.
So you're good. So Yangon, Myanmar, aka Rangoon, Burma. So it is very warm there, and humid, and for many of us in the United States, even who live in the South, might find it uncomfortable, but we acclimate, right, to everything. My work with the restaurant, I didn't manage that restaurant. I opened it. So I was living in Cambodia and doing my work there, and met some people who wanted to open a restaurant in, I'll call it Burma just for purposes of the time frame, because in the 90s it was still being referred to as Burma. So they knew that I had a restaurant background and that I had contacts in Burma. I was born there and lived there as a child, and I speak the language. And so they said, hey, you want to go open a restaurant? And so I did, and I went in January of 1995, And it was an interesting process because the country had been closed to outside investment for so long. So I'm quite proud that that project was one of the first of its kind, for the time, for the era, because I really was inventing the wheel or using wheels that had been invented back during the British colonial occupation of Burma. So we're going back a long, long time. So it was a very interesting project. I'm really proud of it. And the restaurant is still there. I don't have anything to do with it, but the restaurant has survived all these years and has new ownership, and I look forward to going and visiting, hopefully within the next couple of years.
Other than yourself and your own books, what are some of your favorite authors and books?
Oh, what a great question. Aminata Forna wrote a book called The Hired Hand. She is a really interesting writer. She is originally from Africa and then relocated to the UK, or I think that's where she's based out of. And she writes wonderful, beautiful literary fiction. I really like the writer Lawrence Osborne. He is British, but based out of Bangkok, and he writes. Most of his books have now been optioned for films, and one of them, called The Forgiven, was released, I think it was last year, and stars Jessica Chastain and Ralph Fiennes. So The Forgiven, a marvelous story. Those come to mind.
My final question is, what is your favorite place to live in the world?
Well, gosh, I'm so privileged to be able to even consider that question. I would say that I would like to return to Myanmar, because that's kind of where my soul resides. But it is really hot, and that's hard for people with MS. So I think I would, in a perfect world, I would like to live maybe 4 to 6 months a year in Myanmar, and the rest of the time here in the Pacific Northwest, which is just a marvelous place to live.
My favorite place, if I could live anywhere in the world, because I've only lived in East Central Illinois my entire life, and we have a climate that is either very hot or very cold, and there's short in-between seasons.
Gotcha.
Yeah, but if I were to live anywhere in the world, it would probably be somewhere in northern Minnesota where it's cold much of the year.
You like the cold?
I cannot tolerate hot weather very well.
Yeah, you better not go to Southeast Asia. You could just read my books and then you'll feel like you're in Southeast Asia because they're very descriptive.
Lya Badgley, you are an amazing guest for this podcast, and I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thank you, Aaron. All the best to you.
Lya was a wonderful guest to interview. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Facebook at AuthorAAC and on Instagram at AACscribe. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.